Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for being with us today and for joining this important and deeply personal conversation on infertility for Black women physicians. As Black women in medicine, we carry the weight of excellence, service, and resilience, often at the expense of our own health and emotional well-being. Infertility is a journey that, too, many face in silence, and when layered with the unique challenges of our professional roles and cultural expectations. Today's webinar is about breaking that silence. It's about creating space for truth-telling, for healing, for education, and also for advocacy. We are here to center your stories, your experiences, and your strength. Whether you are navigating this journey now, have walked it in the past, or are just here in support, you are welcome and you are not alone. My name is Crystalline Washington, and I am the chair of the Council on Concerns of Women Physicians. The CCWP is a standing council of the National Medical Association, and we partner every quarterly with different sections of the National Medical Association to host webinars for African American physicians. This webinar will be co-hosted by the OBGYN section, and we have the OBGYN section chair, Dr. Cassandra Henderson, who's going to be here today to give us greetings from that section as well.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Henderson, chair of the OBGYN section of the National Medical Association, a co-sponsor of this event. And I want to welcome you with Dr. Washington and for this unbelievably informative evening, which I'm sure that you all will enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henderson. So I'll start by introducing our moderator. Her name is Dr. Alicia Christie. She's also a member of our council, also a member of the OBGYN section, and also an REI physician as well. So Dr. Christie is an NMA member. She's a retired Army physician and activist and a watercolor artist. She received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University, and she was an AOA graduate of Northwestern University School of Medicine. She received her master's degree in clinical research from Duke University. Dr. Christie was the first and only African-American female department chair at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. After her retirement, she continues her work as a physician advocate with the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Association of Reproductive Medicine, the National Medical Association, Vote ER, and several military veteran advocacy groups. Her work has been published in multiple medical journals and has been featured in the Library of Congress, at Dulles, and national airports. Dr. Christie, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson and Dr. Washington. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the distinguished members of tonight's panel. The full bios can be found in the program. I'm going to start with Dr. Lisa Green. She's a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist and an associate residency program director. Her clinical interests include fertility preservation for survivors of cancer and health disparities. She has a particular interest in LGBTQIA+ family building. Her other research interests include endometriosis, fertility preservation, and health disparities. Dr. Tia Jackson-Bay is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist with RMA in Brooklyn, New York. She is an assistant professor at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Her professional interests include fertility-related education, advocacy, and mentoring reproductive health providers. Our last panelist, Tori Como Plowden, MD, is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist, REI division director, and associate program director. She is an associate professor, and her clinical interests include health disparities in infertility, fibroids, and sexual health. In order to answer as many questions from the audience as possible, I'd like to ask the panel members to please keep your responses to 3 minutes or less. This first question is for you, Dr. Green. How do cultural stigmas around infertility in the Black community impact Black women physicians who are struggling with fertility, and how can REI physicians better navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I could spend an hour on a lecture giving you all the ways in which our cultural stigmas can negatively impact Black women physicians as they're trying to build their family. So I'll jump to the second part of your question. The way that we as REI physicians can better navigate that space is through education. I think programs such as this, in which we're getting the word out and we're having conversations and kind of elevating this on a national stage, is extremely important. And I will say, you know, this is our space and our time to educate our patients. Now, the cultural stigmas that we have in our community that are going to negatively impact fertility are vast. You know, really and truly, infertility, regardless of your ethnicity, is one of isolation. You know, there's a lot of shame and taboo surrounding the diagnosis of infertility, where it's something that people just don't talk about or don't feel comfortable in sharing. And so that can be isolating in itself, leading to depression, anxiety, and other factors. And there's also delay in diagnosis. We know there's a lot of medical mistrust in our community for many really valid reasons, whether it's historical or present day, racial biases, and these things that discourage engagement with the healthcare system, that often lead to a delay in people even showing up or being provided with referrals for future care. There's also the cultural myth of the hypersexuality of the Black female, right? And so there's a lot of push oftentimes for contraception when we're talking about family building. And I like to remind folks, you know, well, family planning also means talking about when to have kids and when is it appropriate to have those conversations when there's a delay that's happening. Then there's the feelings of inadequacy that people often deal with. We often in medical education talk about imposter syndrome, or feelings of not feeling or feeling inadequate. And essentially, you see a lot of that in our patients that are feeling like everyone around them is getting pregnant, especially if you're in a specialty like mine, you're an OBGYN, where you're seeing so many pregnant patients and wondering what is wrong with my body. And I'll end with this, you know, there's just a lack of Black women being included in the narrative of infertility. We know that there is a disparity in which, you know, the majority of patients that are seeking, you know, assisted reproduction really are typically white women. And there is this, for many reasons, there's a delay in getting care out to women of color. And there's the financial implications as well. They just, I could go on and on and on in terms of how the stigmas are vast and the biases and barriers are really vast within the population that leads to this problem.
Dr. Plowden and Dr. Jackson-Bey, would you like to comment further on this question? We'll move on to our next question. Dr. Jackson-Bey, are there biological or systemic factors that uniquely impact infertility rates in Black women, particularly those in high stress, high achievement careers like medicine?
This is a great question. I'm so excited, and thank you for the organizers for putting this panel together, because I think it's so important and timely. There are lots of different, biologic factors, just in the sense of things that we may be at higher risk for, that is not always knowingly connected to fertility, but absolutely has a huge impact on fertility. And so particularly for women in our field, we have long periods of training with going to college and then medical school and then residency and fellowships. Some people choose to go back to fellowships, career changes, all of these things, while helping you to establish your career. If you're not actively family building during that process, waiting until the end, until you're ready and you're established, could mean that you lost valuable time that unfortunately could impact your chances of success when you are ready. And so that factor of being older, being what we call advanced reproductive age, definitely does play a role in your chances of success and unfortunately in having issues. Something that we'll probably talk about a little bit tonight is uterine fibroids. And while fibroids in and of themselves do not cause infertility, I think the burden of uterine fibroids in Black women is something that we can't ignore, but it's also the extent of the disease. Black women usually present with fibroids at an earlier age, and by the time there's an intervention, they're more severe in terms of the presentation, and that also can kind of dictate the treatment options that are available, particularly for someone who may want to have a family. I know stories recently of young women reaching out to me who are medical trainees, in our fields, who don't feel comfortable to manage their fibroids, or being told that this is not the right time for surgery, and needing to delay their own care. These are women who do fibroid surgeries on other people and cannot seek the care for themselves. And so these things absolutely do play a role. Other factors that have been shown to be higher in Black women Things like tubal factor infertility. This is where the fallopian tubes have sustained damage, either due to pelvic infections like sexually transmitted infections, pelvic inflammatory disease. Oh, it was young, I was in college, but no one helped them to connect that this could impact their fertility later in life. Even having an ectopic pregnancy. This is a hot topic because, again, after an ectopic pregnancy, there is a chance that you do have tubal factor, but someone may not give them that information, or they may have had a surgical removal of a single tube without proper follow-up about how this could impact their future fertility. So there's a lot of that. I think on the last thing I just wanted to say, just on the biologic side, is endometriosis. We talk a lot about endometriosis. When I was a medical student, we were told this was a white, thin, young woman's disease. And therefore, even as a provider, it was not on my radar. I've seen more endometriosis in young Black women with chronic pelvic pain, some of them without any complaints at all. And so now we've missed this opportunity to counsel them to prevent progression of their endo, and to really, identify a problem much earlier than when they're presenting for infertility care or for fertility preservation later in life. There are other more cultural significant things, systemic factors. Dr. Green touched on this, but there are a lot of myths that, others impose on us, but that we also have embodied over time about our chances for fertility success. Magical hyperfertility, too many babies. There's this focus on controlling our fertility in a negative way, and not enough honest conversations on what needs to happen when you're ready to have a baby. How can you preserve your fertility for the future? And particularly, being open and honest with people about those options instead of stigmatizing it. I hear a lot of young women come to me and say, everyone thinks I'm crazy. They're mad that I'm even coming to see you, but I really want to freeze my eggs. And I'm like, absolutely, this is where you should be. So yeah, I would, put that all together just to say that there are lots of different factors that are unique to us, some biologic, some cultural, but it can place us at a disadvantage.
Before I move on to the next question, I'd like to remind the audience to place their questions in the Q&A section. And before I move on to the next question, were there any comments from any of the other panelists on this last question? Dr. Plowden, how should we approach fertility preservation counseling with Black women in medicine, especially early in their careers?
Thank you for that question. Thank you guys for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to be here with you and talk about these topics that are particularly relevant to my community. So I think that my answer to your question is multifactorial, as you will see is the theme with most of these questions. So thinking about removing stigma. So when we talk about fertility preservation, yes, I think fertility preservation is obviously important, but it's also to normalize the idea that people who are in training may want to build their families. Nowhere is it said that just because you want to be a physician, that you have to wait until training is completed before you even consider building your family or what that might look like for you. There are many people who successfully have children throughout all stages of medical training, whether that be in medical school, in residency, in fellowship, as an early attending. I mean, I have friends who've had babies in medical school, residency, and fellowship, and they've done well, and they still have been able to achieve whatever goals, professional goals that they wanted to have. So I think just this idea of the stigma associated with, it's very common for a woman in her late 20s to want to build her family. And just because that woman has chosen to be a physician doesn't mean that she has to forego family building. So eliminating that stigma and making it normal for any woman to decide that she wants to build her family when she wants to build her family, when she feels that it's right for her. Of course, oocyte cryopreservation is something that we don't talk about enough, and yet it's also maybe overly hyped in some ways. Now, what I mean by that is that people should know that that oocyte cryopreservation is an option and should be provided all of that information, and particularly have the opportunity to talk with a reproductive endocrinology and infertility subspecialist, because deciding whether or not to freeze your eggs is a very nuanced kind of conversation, depending on what is right for you and depending on, a multitude of factors, including your age, when you think you might be interested in family building, whether you have found a partner that you want to build a family with or not. So a detailed, in-depth conversation regarding that. But also, I don't think, I think this idea of delaying fertility almost indefinitely because you have these eggs in the bank and you now have a guarantee that you'll have a child is misleading, right? Because that is not a guarantee. Yes, it can give you more reproductive options, but just because you have eggs frozen does not guarantee that you're going to be able to have all of the childbearing goals that you ultimately want. And so I think, having a realistic, nuanced conversation and really understanding the options that you have and that are available to you. I think arming ourselves with knowledge is important. These topics, particularly in Black communities, tend to not necessarily be something that people are comfortable discussing, even among healthcare providers. So a lot of physicians that I see in my practice, particularly if they don't have, if their subspecialty is not related to OBGYN or REI, really aren't as well versed in the fact that ovarian aging is a very real thing, and that regardless of how healthy you are and how well you take care of yourself and how balanced your diet is, ovarian aging is inevitable. We are born with all the eggs that we'll ever have. And so sometimes people don't really have a true understanding of what that might look like for them. And I've had patients, physicians who are obviously highly educated, be completely blindsided that they may have difficulty getting pregnant when they start trying at age 40, and they haven't really considered what that means. So I think all of those things are important to start thinking about early in your career. People should have this idea of a reproductive life plan, and that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be hard and fast. It's just this idea of, do you want to have children? If you want to have children, what does that look like for you? Are you a person who doesn't want to have children? If not, that's great. If you're a person who does want to have children, maybe thinking about, well, ideally, how many children might I want to have? Or what might be a good time for me to have that child? If my goal is to have 3 children, I probably can't wait to start at age 39. That probably won't work very well. So just having these, conversations, either with your partner. If you don't have a partner, that's okay. You can also think about what that might look like for you, even if a partner is not in the picture at this time. So just having those having the space to think about it earlier in your career and giving yourself permission to explore what that looks like for you as an individual, I think is really important.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question, were there any other comments on this topic? Dr. Green, how has your identity influenced how you counsel and support patients who look like you?
You're mute.
You're muted. You're muted, Dr. Green.
Trying to be responsible. Thank you for that question. I think for me as a Black woman and physician, when I'm having conversations with my patients, I recognize that, I treat them like family. I treat them like friends. I am a first-generation college graduate, and so I do understand that there just is a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of conversations that aren't being had within families. And so I do a really good, or I hope a really good job of just kind of building trust in those first those first visits, but also what Dr. Kumal had mentioned about goal setting. That's extremely important. At the end of every visit, right? Actually, in the beginning, how we lead with, what are our goals? What are you hoping to get out of this visit? How many children would you like to have? How do we want to space our kids? How old are we now? Do we have a partner? If we don't have a partner, are we interested in being a single parent by choice? But we really do outline a plan. And you'd be surprised how many patients come back 2 and 3 years later and they said, Dr. Green, I remember you told me when I turned 35, I had to come back if I wasn't with somebody. We have those conversations, and I hope to build that rapport where we can have or I can at least say the things oftentimes that people just want to ask or just don't feel comfortable asking. And so I think just having a background that comes from just a diverse, having diverse family and friends really has been, helpful in having those conversations.
Thank you. A resource I wanted the audience to know about before we move on to the next question is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine has a very good patient resource site, reproductivefacts.org, and we'll be providing some additional resources in the Q&A, but I did want the audience to know about that particular resource. Dr. Jackson-Bay, how can physician communities better support their colleagues facing infertility, especially when silence or stigma may be heightened by both race and professional identity?
This is huge and so timely as I'm dealing with a few physician and healthcare worker patients who are very stressed by their inflexible work schedules and really feel this crunch to finally do what they want to do for themselves, building their families, fertility preservation, but feel such an inflexibility and a rigidity with the medical system that it poses a problem. And so I think there need to be huge changes. It starts at the individual level. And, we really don't realize, but there's so much power in our individual and collective voices. I always encourage people, if you're able to, if you don't have infertility insurance where you're employed or your healthcare system, HR needs to hear from you. Your chair needs to hear from you. Your, vice chair and dean of the medical school need to hear from you, because at this rate, we're graduating 50+% medical students are female. And this is something that's important to family building. Unfortunately, we're most kind of affected and kind of the face of infertility. And if they're not providing, services that are dire and important to us, then they deserve to hear that feedback. I think at the next level, we have to make sure that these systems allow for flexibility. This really doesn't just stop at getting your treatment. This also means, what are the support services for young families? A big deterrent in delaying your family is, I don't have the money, I don't have the support. What am I going to do with a kid? I'm, in residency working, 12, 15 plus hours a day. And so we really have to look at this model a little bit differently, advocating for ourselves, advocating as a collective, being better and more responsible peers to each other. I remember during training, I'm an OBGYN resident, right? We literally deliver babies for a living. And there was still snide remarks if someone was going out on maternity leave and, needed to have coverage, had a sick child. And so we have to kind of start this conversation from within and make sure that we are also not perpetuating these same systems. We come through a system of patriarchy and racism, and there are enough forces against us if we cannot, kind of protect and make sure that we're serving each other. I think so. The flexible work schedule to me is absolutely huge. And if someone has to be at rounds every morning, they're not going to be able to do the morning monitoring that's needed. And so just without as much explanation, just letting people have more flexible schedules, peer coverage that is not punitive, like you need to find your own coverage, having a buddy system, and maybe, something that's very popular in the corporate world is having Slack. Slack is kind of like a social media messaging app where people can create different topic streams. And so a lot of, patients in their companies will have a Slack for the IVF or infertility or queer family building. And that's kind of how they share resources and information. Whereas I feel like it's a lot more taboo to do that in medicine. We're scared of stigma. We're scared of being ostracized. We're scared of having our careers downgraded and derailed. Which is a real fear, but I think that kind of stops us from being able to move forward and help each other.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention on the ASRM site, there is also listed a number of resources for advocacy. Organizations like Resolve, Broken Brown Egg, Fertility for Color Girls, the Cade Foundation, and you can find that all on the ASRM website, and we'll be putting some of those links in the chat box during the Q&A. Dr. Plowden, what advice would you give to a Black woman physician who is struggling with infertility, but feels isolated or unseen in both her workplace and medical care?
Thank you for that question. I think a little bit of piggybacking off of what Dr. Jackson Bay was just discussing, having some flexibility in scheduling. I think a lot of times people who are not REI doctors or who haven't been through infertility don't understand how intense the monitoring can be when you're undergoing infertility cycle. And if you are a program director, of a residency or a fellowship, you absolutely can positively impact your trainees by giving them the time that they need to do this, if this is something that they're interested in. I think that's important to note. A lot of times there can be stigma surrounding infertility within medicine, but I find that it is more common specifically within Black women, and that is Black women who are physicians or who are not physicians. A lot of times, because of some of the stereotypes that have been mentioned earlier, this idea of hyperfertility, Black women who experience infertility really believe that they are, like, quote, the only Black woman who is infertile. And that can be very isolating and can certainly lead to significant issues related to quality of life, or related to how you feel about yourself, related to your ability to cope and not feel like your body is broken because it's not doing what you think it should be doing. And so that's very heavy. Add into that the fact that we are all caregivers. We're caregivers. We may be caregivers in our personal lives, as far as, having children, having siblings that that may be ill, or parents that may be ill, but we're all caregivers on a professional level. So all day long, we're worrying about other people. And when you add that in, it just makes it a little bit more difficult to think about what you might need. And self-care is not selfish. It is a revolutionary act. So it's important for us to be able to give ourselves permission to worry about our own healthcare and our own priorities. And that includes our priorities of potentially bearing children, if that is something that we wish to do. So I think that surrounding yourself with some sort of support system, and that may be of other Black women physicians, that may be of other female professionals, that Black women professionals that you are friends with. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard, though, because people aren't having these conversations. I think one thing that patients seem to be surprised about is that once they start using their voice, kind of get over some of that stigma and say, I'm experiencing infertility, or I'm having difficulty getting pregnant, or I would like to be pregnant, and it hasn't been so easy so far. People start coming out of the woodwork, their cousin, their aunt, their sister. I mean, literally, people are not necessarily having these conversations, but if according to WHO, 1 in 6 couples experience infertility, somebody who has infertility. Someone who someone someone close to you has experienced infertility or is currently having an infertility struggle, even though she may not have shared it with you. That person, someone who has it. And if you start having these courageous conversations, you might be surprised by how many people in your circle will reach out and will be able to offer you that support that you need.
Thank you. And I want to say to the panelists, if you want to comment on any of the previous questions, please feel free to do so. Dr. Green, how does medical training and the structure of academic medicine impact access to timely fertility care for women physicians, particularly Black women?
Yeah, I think in some of the prior questions, the panelists have definitely touched on this particular problem that we have in our academic medicine environment. The largest predictor of success for fertility is age. And as Black women, we're the most educated demographic. And so we are the most likely to want to delay starting our families, and so that is going to negatively impact us when we're ready to start. And so oftentimes, another thing that we deal with in the medical space is timing. So timing of monitoring through fertility treatment, but also in order to get that monitoring, you have to open up and tell your program director, tell your attendings, tell people that you're trying to start a family, which again, oftentimes is not received as good news from your colleagues and from your fellow peers. And so we do need to do a better job of normalizing building our families within training. We need to do a better job of being supportive for women who decide to have children while they're in training, and let them know that that's okay. But also what Dr. Como-Plottin was saying, we don't talk about it a lot. We talk about the 1 in 8 of couples that are struggling. So in every checkout line that you stood in, you're surrounded by people that have been on a similar journey, and you're not alone. But that's really difficult to feel in those moments when you feel isolated, especially in medicine, where you feel like you can't share that you're trying to start a family, or that you're running into difficulty for numerous reasons. And I do think another thing that we run into, because there aren't a lot of Black people in medicine, is just not having support systems, right? Oftentimes having colleagues or peers that you can talk to about what you're struggling with, or feeling open about your struggles and your journeys that you're having in academics can be really difficult. And so I think our inherent structure of wait is very problematic when we have a finite amount of time for reproduction. And Dr. Como-Plottin said this: ovarian aging, regardless of how well you take care of yourself, it is a factor. And we are all going to age. And so it is something that when we're planning and we're making plans for our future, in the same way we're planning on how to study for these board exams and what degrees we want to get, we need to start thinking and planning about what type of family we would like to have. That's an important thing to be mindful of.
I'll just add one thing there, because again, we're like sisters on this forum. We are in like so many different groups and committees, but we also like mentor a lot of people. And so making sure that you include this in your mentoring, we're so focused on, oh my gosh, all right, how are we going to get you into medical school, residency, fellowship? But it's like, wait, have you thought about this? What's going on here? Are you having any issues? Do you want a family? And not waiting actually until residency. Sometimes people are actually already, advanced age, or have other reproductive health issues at that time. We need to take a step back sometimes and even think about it in medical school. Everyone think back to 4th year. This is when you probably have the most time out of your whole educational journey, and would be a great opportunity. And so again, if we start speaking to people about it early, even if it's not covered, maybe that's an opportunity to save money and work towards that, just to have it as like a goal in mind, even for us within our own circles.
And that's a nice segue into the next question, Dr. Jackson-Bey, which is, are there institutional changes, for instance, residency policies, fertility benefits, that you'd recommend to better support reproductive justice for Black women in medicine?
I would love to see more medical schools adopt some sort of component of the 3rd or 4th year as like a real life 101. Talk about financing, buying a home, negotiating your contracts and your family building. And if this is what you want to do, this is how you do it, and things like that. I think that's a really important life skill that unfortunately may be not preparing our trainees as well. Similar for residency programs and fellowship programs, being able to include fertility preservation, family building options, whether that's insurance coverage, or sometimes there's just like a grant or allotment of money, to have it available, but then to also advertise it, and then also not to make it hard for their residents to access, because that is something that I've seen even in programs where they have it. All the residents are afraid to take advantage. I can't take time off. I don't have time for that. I'm trying to get into a fellowship. This is my research block. I'm making up for this, or I'm covering someone for that. And so trying to eliminate those barriers in-house for sure. I want the fertility benefits to be all encompassing. It should not be only if you need IVF. You should not have to explain yourself for fertility preservation within the medical community. We should be the first people who understand how important this is. Embryo banking for young couples. Sometimes they're dual physician couples in residency and in training programs who could benefit from that. Oncofertility is something that is often overlooked, and unfortunately, Black women, again, are least offered fertility sparing or fertility preservation techniques prior to their cancer treatment. A lot of times it is assumed that they don't want to proceed. Sometimes it comes from the patient, right? Because cancer is a very scary diagnosis and people say, no, I just want to move forward. But if you have the connection to a REI facility, physician, practice to say, hey, we can see you the same day, we can see you next day, we can just have 30 minutes, an hour phone call. You know, I need you to know about these options. I want you to understand what is possible when you make it to the other side of this diagnosis. And so I think that's really important. But the last thing, again, I just circle back to making residency training and academic and private practice medicine more family friendly. We are graduating more female physicians. The workforce is going to change tremendously over the next decade or so, and we cannot fit ourselves into a mold that was built for men who had wives, who had children, and had people to take care of those children. Now we are both physicians and wives and mothers, and so the working model is going to have to change to accommodate that.
Thank you. Dr. Plowden, I know you recently authored an ACOG committee opinion on infertility disparities and access. Do you see differences in how fertility benefits are used or accessed across racial lines among your physician patients?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So to my knowledge, there hasn't been a study that specifically looked at access along racial lines within physicians only. We definitely have had multiple studies that have shown that Black women are much less likely to access infertility treatment, and that can be for a multitude of factors. And I'm going to, extrapolate that this is probably also an issue for Black women physicians. But some of it is related to stigma, which we've kind of discussed. Some of it is related to not being referred in a timely fashion. Black women are less likely to be referred. And when they are referred, they've often been suffering from infertility like 2 to 3 times as long as their Caucasian counterparts. And that can have a specific negative impact on success rates, because we mentioned earlier that one of the biggest factors of success is related to age, the age that you are at which you present for care. So that's a huge issue. There are some, so across the country, whether we're talking about urban settings or in rural settings, Black women do not access fertility care as often as you would expect that they would, based on demographics alone, based on our percentage of the population. There was a study that, this study is several years old now, but it looked specifically at a military population in which they have a better, more equal access to care model than we have in the private sector. And in that particular study, they showed that Black women were overrepresented, meaning that they accessed care more than they did on the outside in that equal to access care kind of model. And I think that still holds true currently. I think that my practice does have more Black patients than maybe this typical practice does, probably for that reason.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, Dr. Green, if you can comment. We were speaking earlier about a resource on the Resolve site that provides information about insurance coverage by state. Where could the audience find that?
Yes, and I will drop that in the chat for folks if they want to check it out. But I think Resolve does a really good job of breaking down the country state by state, and they review the specific nuances of coverage for each state. So some states are mandated, meaning that insurance providers, with some exceptions, need to provide fertility benefits to their constituents. And so Resolve has a website that will go state by state. It'll outline whether the state has mandated coverage or not. And if there is coverage in that state, if there are any kind of policy that points toward fertility benefits, they will outline that. So you can always check out to say, hey, the state of Maryland, does that have fertility coverage? If yes, then, or if no, then it'll also outline policies that may have failed or even upcoming legislation that you could advocate for or even stand behind in order to try to get fertility coverage for your state.
Thank you. And keep your mic unmuted because this next question is for you. What kind of research is still missing or underfunded when it comes to infertility in Black women? And how can we as physicians advocate for better data?
Yeah, there is not a lot of research when it comes to Black women in general in the fertility space. You know, we don't access care typically at the same rate as some of our other counterparts. And so there's missing genomic data. How do the other social determinants of health, how do they impact our fertility? You know, Dr. Komoplata made an excellent point to say that, hey, oftentimes, even when you would expect us to interface or engage with the healthcare system regarding our fertility, we're not. And so what are some of the reasons and some of the barriers that exist that are causing that disparity to happen? You'd be surprised to know that some of our databases aren't even asking the question of ethnicity of our patients. And so I think that that is something that in the coming years we're hoping to change, but there just isn't a lot of information broken down by race and ethnicity regarding IVF outcomes, or even some of the challenges that people might experience with regards to fertility outcomes. Better understanding the psychological impact that people may face being in this space and identified as a person of color. You know, all those things are missing, really and truly. We just have so many questions when it comes to people of color and fertility. And so how is us as physicians, how can we better advocate for our patients? We should advocate for increase in funding. Unfortunately, you know, recently there's been a lot of pulling away of funding. So we're kind of going in the opposite direction when it comes to answering a lot of those questions, but raising awareness and having the conversation. I had a patient who was a family medicine physician, and, you know, she had her own fertility journey. And I will say, after she and I had a couple of visits, she is now one of my biggest referrals. Like, she's constantly having that conversation with her patients. You know, are you thinking about having a child? How old are you? How many kids would you like to have? You really need to see a reproductive endocrinologist if you're of a certain age, just to have a conversation. And just having more of those where we're normalizing those conversations with our patients, where we're normalizing and we're asking the question, because you'd be oftentimes surprised that, you know, given our day-to-day and a lot of misconception that exists out in the social aspect, that people aren't thinking about, you know, struggles that they may have. You know, the assumption is that, oh, everyone in my family just gets pregnant right away. And so I always thought I would too. And so, you know, most people are shocked and taken aback when they find out that they have difficulty in getting pregnant. And so definitely just normalizing that conversation and sharing. I will say, in a social media aspect, I was really proud of folks like Grab Barrel Union and more people that are coming forward and saying, hey, I've had these struggles, because I think, you know, oftentimes people identify with folks that are that they see in celebrities, and that has made the conversation and more comfortable for people to just kind of bridge that gap or start those conversations, which are really helpful. But there's so much that we still need to know that we just don't understand. Fibroids, we've known about fibroids for decades, and you still be surprised that we just don't understand its true impact and what it can have on fertility. And so I think as physicians, continue to advocate for more science, continue to push us to ask the questions, and continue to push for funding, and specifically to target patients and recruit patients in the African-American and people of color communities.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson-Bey, this last question is for you. How can we make sure that race-based disparities in reproductive medicine are addressed without falling into stereotypes or harmful generalizations?
I think it is important to include the people who these studies are about. Make sure the stakeholders are at the table. Do not try to address things from afar, right? I'm talking about this a lot recently, but just making sure that the people who are including your study, if that's patient advocacy groups, you know, people who are represented by that group, they need to be at the table. They need to be part of the discussions, and particularly part of any solutions that may be generated. I'm really, you know, intent on making sure that research has an anti-racist and anti-biased approach. And this is something that, over the past decade, we've been working really hard to make sure that more and more publications, make that a requirement. Who was involved in your study? What was the patient population? What were the efforts made to include a more inclusive study population, and why were you not able to? And so these are really important, tasks to really hold researchers to, because if you don't, we know what happens. You just revert to kind of studying the same small groups and extrapolating that to everyone, when we know that there are big differences between groups. And it's not just along racial lines, it's income lines, it's, geographic, cultural. So I think that's really important too. We need more funding, not less. We need more money and ways to garner more interest. Through the ASRM, we are really dedicated to the pipeline of students all the way from high school through college, through medical school, and really trying to galvanize their interest in reproductive medicine careers. And so those kind of programs actually impact these things too. It's the trainees who do most of the research, and the trainees who you can mentor and who can get the projects done and get them completed. And so being able to make sure that we continue to pour into young people and to make them aware of these types of fields, will later ensure that we have the metrics that we need. The last thing I'll say is just not to be stagnant. Unfortunately, we've all written papers and then realized that, oh my God, we're referencing things from over a decade ago. And we're kind of like recycling some of the same statistics over and over. And so not to just like rest on the laurels of, this paper that was now published 20 years ago, making sure that we're keeping it fresh, that we're keeping things current and updated, which doesn't always feel like a popular thing in research, but sometimes it needs to be done again. You can do the same study again with new data, with a new time point, and let's see if there's something different.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank the panel for their very thoughtful responses to the questions. And now I'd like to move to audience questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A section. And I would ask that please do not put personal information in the Q&A that would violate your privacy. So do stressors play a role in infertility? One of the comments I'd like to make about that is one of the difficulties is most likely, yes, but it's something that's very difficult to study because it's very difficult to quantitate and to measure. And individuals who are doing research and work in this space have said that what they're moving towards is that infertility is stressful and that patients undergoing infertility treatments and evaluations need to be supported. So in terms of the mechanisms by which it causes it and what kinds of stress causes it, there's a lot about that's unknown.
I'll just add, because I think that so many people who find themselves battling with infertility in any form are told to just rest and relax. Baby, there is no amount of vacationing that is going to overcome a medical issue like infertility. And so I think that while we are all subject to stress in multiple different ways, to try to untease that as a source of your infertility, we want you to minimize your stress. We want you to be healthy. For Black female physicians, we know that there's this triple burden of taking care of yourself, taking care of your families, taking care of your church and your sororities. Who's taking care of you? That's the level of stress that we're talking about. Do you sleep? Do you eat well? Are you able to exercise? How's your financial outlook? Because that's a significant source of stress too. Are you in therapy? All of these different things that actually are like real wellness and not just like getting your hair and nails done. And so that is more or less what we want to be able to focus on. You're never going to be able to eliminate all sources of stress, but absolutely, we want you to be, as close to your peak health as possible, especially if you're undergoing this process or preparing for pregnancy.
Thank you. So there's a question about how do you choose a reputable IVF clinic, and are there questions that you should ask?
So most, probably about 95% of IVF clinics in the country report to the SART database, SART. If you Google that, the information will come up. You're able to search by clinic to see like what those clinical outcomes are. And then it also can break it down based on age of the person. And it can give you a way to compare different clinics, because you would be able to see like one clinic has a success rate of X and a different clinic has a success rate of Y. So that can give you some information as about like objective information that clinics can't like alter so that you can have an understanding of what their success rates are like.
Thank you. Dr. Washington Kelly, you indicated you wanted to make a comment about stressors and infertility. We'll see if there's something in the chat box. For fertility preservation, can you speak to age-related decrease in yield? For example, freezing eggs at age 35 versus waiting to age 38.
Yeah, so for fertility preservation, our best results are going to be less than age 35. So the younger your eggs are, the better those eggs are going to respond when you need to use them, if you need to use them in the future. But in studies that have looked at what point in time should you freeze your eggs from a cost and actual use benefit. So there are people that are going to freeze eggs that may not go on to use them. Again, 85% of people are going to have no delay in family building when they go to do so. So at that age or time point, that's where 37 and 38 was picked from, to say that, hey, if you have now gone this long without starting your family building, then this is a good age at which there's going to be a significant drop in the quality of your eggs. You should go ahead and freeze them.
Yeah, I agree with the point that Dr. Green made. And this is part of the reason why, this is a really nuanced conversation to have with your own REI doctor to kind of help you understand and tease out what might or might not be a good time for you. The experimental label came off of egg freezing roughly in 2012, 2013. Prior to that, all egg freezing had to be done under an IRB approved protocol, typically for people who had cancer. So this idea of elective egg freezing hasn't been around for a long period of time. And some of the studies, in a lot of the studies, people haven't even yet come back for those eggs. So it's kind of hard to always have a good idea about the cost. The other thing that is they're hidden costs. So, and what I mean by that is long-term costs. If you never use those eggs and you're paying for freezing and storage every year, what does that look like for you? If you're ultimately able to conceive in the traditional way without having to utilize those eggs, when would you start to think about perhaps, getting, letting those eggs go if you think that you're done with childbearing? And so it's a really nuanced conversation. I don't think that there's really a right or wrong answer. But it is true that if people freeze their eggs very young, they may or may not actually come back for those eggs.
To use them. I'm practicing in New York City, where there are a lot of large companies that cover the cost of egg freezing. And so we're starting to see younger and younger people, doing egg freezing, which, I don't shun. It's so hard for us to know what the future holds. And, you saw recent headlines that there are more women, having, or the demographic of new mothers over the age of 40 is increasing as younger mothers is actively decreasing. And I think that speaks to a trend of even further delayed childbearing. And I'm sure a lot of those families were built utilizing our services. So I think, the young people may delay family building even longer than we are now, and therefore may have some increased risk, with just aging. That there was another study that looked at, the cost of freezing your eggs at age 33 versus going 3 rounds of IVF at 43. And, the outcomes favored freezing your eggs at younger age. And that's because, again, like Dr. Green said, your response to the medication, the number of eggs retrieved, but it's really the quality of the eggs and, the manipulations that we have to do to them. Young eggs make better embryos. And so if you never used them, then maybe that was not, did not feel like a worthwhile investment for you. But should you need to use them, I would have wanted you to have the younger eggs. And we can't go back in time to retrieve that level of quality. And so it is a really nuanced conversation. People who are in a position to do, I definitely would recommend. There are some groups that should even really think about this. If you have a cancer diagnosis, if you are, someone who's living with an autoimmune condition, lupus, or something that's, you're actively taking medication for, even Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. If you are, living yourself with sickle cell anemia, or your children or young people around you have sickle cell, these women do tend to, kind of go through a earlier ovarian decline. And so seeing them at a younger age for fertility preservation might be important. And young people who are considering fibroid surgery, who are diagnosed with endometriosis, who have chronic pelvic pain, that could be a red flag that they are going to have some issues in their reproductive health in the future. And so if you're a provider and you're seeing them, you're treating them, you have them on contraception, at some point you should say, hey, let's send you to REI, see if maybe this is a good option for you. Maybe you start your family building earlier, or maybe you do something like egg or embryo freezing, again, so that you can have more options in the future.
Before I move on to the next question, I want to clarify, do we have a hard stop at 9, or can we continue answering questions?
I believe we can continue as long as it's okay with the panelists.
Okay. This next question also relates to cryopreservation. So if you cryopreserve oocytes in one location, is it a problem if you move to another location?
So
I usually say no. I tell people, leave the eggs wherever you froze them. You do not have to cart your eggs all over the world or the country.
That is true.
If you decide to use them, then we'll re-engage at that point to see if we need to move them to you closer, to another clinic. They don't come home with you. They don't go in your freezer. Or if you would come back for care. And I have, patients who live in other countries, who live across the country, and they'll come back to our center. And so there are some advantages of using your eggs in the facility that froze the eggs, and understanding what their rates are. I always engage people to ask, if you're freezing your eggs there, you want to know about what happens later on. So ask about their thaw survival, ask about their blastogenesis rate from those frozen eggs. And that's fair game in terms of questions.
I would also say, and now the question asked specifically about oocytes. It didn't ask specifically about embryos. But one thing that we've run into recently related to embryos are moving embryos across state lines in some places that are regulating embryos in a different way. And so that is something for a person to consider, particularly if they have embryos in long-term storage. You may or may not want them to be in certain areas of the country based on what some of the policies are in various states. So that's just something to consider as well.
Thank you for that comment. How do you recommend docs approach this topic with employers without it being awkward?
AMWA, which is the American Medical Women's Association, has a toolkit that they have started. So if you search AMWA infertility, it'll pop up. And they talk about like insurance benefits, particularly if you're in a place that doesn't cover, where insurance does not cover fertility treatment. So that can be one way. Another way that I've seen this conversation come up is people use it as part of like their residency education. So having this as a, if you have REs in your facility, asking them to come and talk to the residents about this. And a resident can ask as well, doesn't have to be an attending, but this can bring up this conversation in a way where no particular resident feels like he or she has to kind of like out themselves that they want this information and that can be provided in a way that also gives the program director an opportunity to understand what we're talking about, what this is, what the time requirements are, how common it is, and it can open up the doors for a conversation that is not like, doesn't feel quite so personal, like it impacts you. Another thing that I would say is, you know, sometimes our colleagues that are members of the LGBTQ plus community are not involved in this conversation, but those colleagues know kind of early that they are going to need some assistance to conceive and to grow their families, and so that can be isolating for them. It is definitely an exercise in expanding equity and bringing everyone into the conversation. And so that's also a way that conversations can be started. Like, you know, these are some of the things that our colleagues are dealing with and exploring what that might look like for them.
There was a question about, well, it's a two-part question. One was about support organizations for Black women dealing with fertility, and I provided a written response to that about broken brown eggs and fertility for color girls. But the other part of the question was organizations for Black women physicians.
I am not aware of a fertility organization specifically focusing on Black women physicians, but I will say that organizations like NMA, CCWP, the OBGYN section of NMA are trying to have conversations like this one where we are addressing that issue. I don't know, there may be a role for starting a support group. AMWA does also have some opportunities related to like group fertility coaching that they sometimes offer for free, sometimes for people. And that is just this idea that having having a support group and also having someone be able to kind of coach you through this process, because the infertility journey is just that. It is a journey, and sometimes it can take a prolonged period of time, unfortunately. And so sometimes there are infertility coaches that can help people deal with their own fertility journey on an individual or on a group level.
This next question, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Back to the question, I did want to answer responses. Someone had posed a question about how do you have conversations or difficult conversations with your employer regarding fertility coverage and benefits. One of the ways that we did it at my institution is we kind of came at it from a different lens. And actually we presented it to our leadership as a recruitment tool. There are several studies that have shown that that is a very successful recruitment as well as retention tool for a lot of companies. And so I was going to read these facts off, but Care Fertility did a study where 65% of respondents said that they would change jobs for fertility benefits. And I see that in my own clinic where people at different hospitals will switch to our hospital just for the fertility benefits. There was a study by Fertility IQ that 61% of employees who receive fertility benefit coverage felt more loyal and committed to their employer. So as a retention tool, corporations are more successful in not only recruiting, but also retaining employees, which we know is really costly and hard in today's climate, if they are able to offer these fertility benefits. So sometimes making the economic argument works to oftentimes get coverage for people.
This next question is about pre-implantation genetic testing. Who is a candidate for pre-implantation genetic testing? Is it available everywhere? And should you opt for it above a certain age?
This is a great question. So pre-implantation genetic testing, we most commonly use it to detect aneuploidy, which is an abnormal number of chromosomes in the embryo. And this can be done at the embryo stage before implantation or the embryo transfer. We can also detect a number of genetic diseases that are caused by gene mutations. And so we'll use pre-implantation genetic testing for monosomic disorders to actually, understand if you and your partner are carriers for sickle cell disease. You can screen your embryos for the disease and not transfer affected embryos. You could transfer maybe ones that are unaffected or carriers, like you carry a trait. And so it's really, evolved over the past, almost 30 years as something, a really sophisticated tool. I would say that it is still a little contentious on how much it should be used and needed. I'm in a practice where I use it very frequently, and that's because my patient population is older. There might be a limited number of IVF cycles for their insurance. Patients have, had a long time when they're waiting, and we really just want to go for the embryos that have the best chance of success. And selecting for embryos that have a normal number of chromosomes can do that for some couples. A lot of times we'll consider couples where the woman is over age 35, because just naturally you have an increased risk of having a pregnancy with a chromosomal abnormality at that point. And so that's where I feel like most strong about it. But if younger couples really want to understand, and that's important, couples who have recurrent miscarriage and genetic pregnancy losses in the past may opt to do this testing as well as couples who are carriers for the same gene disorder. So I think that, it may not be completely available at all clinics. It's certainly something that you could ask about. And if it feels important to you, then seek out a clinic that does it. It is not frequently covered by insurance, including fertility-based insurances. And so it could be something that adds cost to your care. But, from my standpoint, I look at it as you pay now or you pay later. If you have to go through multiple embryo transfers without success or with early pregnancy losses, it ends up, in some cases, in some institutions, equaling having paid for the pre-implantation genetic testing up front. And so it's definitely not a one size fits all. It's something to engage your provider about. It may not be covered everywhere and it may not be available everywhere, but I definitely think it's something to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. It's not, its indication is not always clearly identified. Certainly for patients who are on the upper spectrum of reproductive age, it makes a lot of sense. But sometimes for younger patients, if they want it, I think most of us would not, discourage, like say, oh no, this absolutely is something that cannot be done. But you also have to kind of take it a little bit with a grain of salt. There have been a couple of big studies that in practices that utilize PGTA across the spectrum. So everyone in the practice had PGTA, and their pregnancy rates were lower than you would have expected for euploid embryos that fell into that like that age category. So there may be some, it may not be necessary in all cases. Certainly if the female partner is on the upper end of the reproductive spectrum, it can make a lot of sense. And to Dr. Jackson-Bay's point, it can save time. And what I mean by that is if you're 39 years old, you get 4 embryos, and then we do the PGTA testing and we find out that 3 of those 4 embryos are abnormal or aneuploid, then you have saved yourself the disappointment and stress of transferring genetically abnormal embryos that either would have resulted in a pregnancy loss or no pregnancy at all, right? So then that person knows it's much different to know, yes, I have 1 euploid embryo frozen, or I have 4 embryos frozen, but I don't know the genetic makeup of those embryos, especially when you fall into that age category.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. I would tell patients to speak with their physician and weigh the pros and cons. Other instances in which people often use PGT would be if they're a carrier for certain cancer mutations. Oftentimes we'll see people that elect to not to say wipe that out of their family lineage, but often if they know their graphic area, they have a family member that was diagnosed with breast cancer, they will screen embryos oftentimes for that too.
The next question is about research. How do we get more Black women included in research?
I think we have to change our strategy. We have to improve our improve trust with the community. That's one, right? You know, there definitely has been some missteps in the academic community in the past that have led to the lack of engagement, oftentimes in certain communities with researchers and with the research community. Advocate for funding is one, but also the way we target and the way that we are trying to gain patients or that recruitment. So having, you know, physicians of color and more physicians of color that do advocate and encourage research or recruitment into research studies, that is really helpful. Maybe talking more about research and how the value of that and the paucity of data that we have in people of color going to HBCUs and recruiting patients or like I said, going to places in which we are. You know, Essence did a really great job of putting that fibroid study in the magazines that we're reading, right? So going to the populations themselves in order to recruit, I think is a strategy. We need to be more open. The barbershop study, right, for hypertension, like being more open and being more creative on how we engage patients.
What are the panelists' thoughts about exploring reproductive immunology for, Dr. Jackson Bay is answering that question. How do you suggest providers discuss weight as a factor or cause of infertility?
So this is a particularly difficult topic to discuss with patients. It is something that is necessary to discuss, and we certainly know that there are many adverse outcomes that can happen in pregnancies that are impacted by obesity or, you know, severe obesity. With infertility, everything has to be weighed against time, right? Time is a factor, and it may not be on your side depending on how old you are when you're having these conversations. So it is very inappropriate to have someone who has is in an overweight or obese category who's 40, and you say, oh, okay, yeah, go lose some weight and come back in a year and a half. That's not the answer, right? ASRM has kind of advised against this idea of using a strict BMI cutoff and not allowing people to have access to treatment because they fall into a specific BMI category. That alone should not necessarily be the reason to deny treatment to someone. That is definitely an issue. When I have these conversations with patients, you know, Dr. Jackson Bay kind of alluded to it earlier, that we want our patients to be as healthy as possible. And certainly being in a healthy weight category is ideal. And then we can work with our patients to work toward that, to work towards them being in a healthy weight category. If that person is on the younger age of reproductive
Do we have a hard stop at 9:15?
Yes.
Uh,
So
Okay.
does any of our panelists, I think Dr.
they may
Fowler.
have time, a longer.
Oh, it might be the connection.
Sorry.
It's
Okay, go ahead.
No, finish your thought, please. Finish your thought, please.
Oh, I was just saying another thing is that, you know, in obesity in and of itself is also not just the issue. We also want to make sure that our patients don't have uncontrolled diabetes and uncontrolled hypertension. Those are things that sometimes can be addressed, not just in the setting of addressing obesity alone, but those are certainly health factors that we want to make sure are under control before they are able to pursue pregnancy safely.
Dr. Washington Kelly, did I hear you correctly? We had a hard stop at 9:15?
Yes, we'll go ahead and wrap
Okay.
up. Mhm.
Okay.
All right, so again, as we close out the conversations today, I want to thank each of you, our panelists, our moderator, and our attendees for your time today. This has been a very robust conversation with many areas of future work. So let us begin the continued dialogue and support of each other, maybe hold space for one another, change the systems that, are failing us, and affirm that, we are worthy of joy, of healing, and of motherhood, however that may come. Thank you again all for being part of this webinar. Be gentle with yourselves and with each other. For more information about the National Medical Association, more information about CCWP, Council on Concerns of Women Physicians, more information about the obstetrics and gynecology section of the National Medical Association, please go to nmanet.org, and you can also find us on Facebook and also Instagram. Thank you guys so much, and have a great night.
Please. And please attend the national meeting in Chicago, July 19th to 23rd.
Yes, thank you. All right, have a good night,
Have
everyone.
a good night.
Right.